Good morning. Happy Tuesday. It's Miss Sarkis here again. I'm so happy to be with you guys again for another day of learning and another lesson and discussion on theme. Just quickly before we get into our lesson for the day, I want to do a quick recap of what we talked about yesterday. Yesterday, we reviewed the characteristics of fiction, which we will do again this morning. We also looked at a definition of theme and looked at a couple essential questions as readers that we can think about when discussing theme. And then we read a story from Common Lit titled The Tale of Peter Rabbit. And I know many of you are familiar with The Tale of Peter Rabbit. So after reading the story, we discussed the theme, which was the moral or the lesson that the author wanted us to learn. And the moral or the lesson in The Tale of Peter Rabbit was that there will be consequences if you break rules. Again, the moral and the lesson in The Tale of Peter Rabbit was there will be consequences if you break the rules. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen with you again, just like I did yesterday, so that you can follow along with the anchor charts that I have. And the first anchor chart that we're going to look at again today was very familiar from yesterday, the different characteristics of fiction. And just again, to reiterate, when you are reading, you want to be thinking about whether this text is fiction or nonfiction, because again, that really helps us as readers to frame our thinking and to have a better understanding of what we are reading. So let's quickly go through and review what are our characteristics of fiction. We know that our characteristics are fiction is a story. Its main purpose is to entertain us as readers. When we read fiction, we're reading for enjoyment, for pleasure, or for leisure. Fiction is going to contain those key story elements such as characters, setting, where does the story mostly take place, our plot, which is going to be the key events of our story, and our conflict and our resolution. Just remember, conflict is the problem that happens in the story, and the resolution is the solution, or how is that conflict or problem solved. Remember, when we read fiction, we have to read it in order. We must start at the beginning and then read through the middle and then to the end. We cannot simply pick up a fiction story and open it up anywhere and just start reading, because we would be really confused as readers. And lastly, we know that when we read fiction, that we're going to have a theme, which is going to be a moral or a lesson. So let's look again at our handy dandy anchor chart on theme that we looked at yesterday, and let's review the definition of theme. The theme is the message or the lesson that the author wants you, remember you are the reader, to take away from the story. And we talked yesterday that the theme typically is centralized around the main character or main characters in the story. Let's look at a couple key questions that we can ask ourselves as readers when we are thinking about theme. What did the character or characters learn? And how did the character or characters grow? And then yesterday we looked at some common themes that we find when we are reading fiction. So today we have another story from Common Lit. The title of today's story is The Champion of Quiet. And there is a link for this story in the RPS at home page. So you can either follow along with me, or you can pause the video right now, go ahead and find that link, and then you can bring up the story on your computer screen and then follow along with me. All right, The Champion of Quiet by Tracy Stewart. This was written in 2015. Just a little quick intro on who our author is. Tracy Stewart has written for highlights. In this short story, a quiet girl volunteers to be a team captain in gym class. As you read, identify who Maggie chooses as teammates and the different reasons for choosing them. Okay, here we go. It was a Tuesday, and Maggie hated Tuesdays. Tuesdays meant one thing: gym class. Gym class meant one thing: picking teams. Picking teams meant one thing: Maggie would be picked last, as always. Maggie was a new student that year in a class of champions. To help herself remember the other kids, she'd come up with a special title for each one. There was Kevin, champion of the clean desk, and Linny, champion of knowing the answer first, and Caroline, champion of tardy, and so on. And the word tardy means to be late. If you are tardy for school, that means you are late. She'd had to think long and hard to figure out her own special title. After 5 whole weeks of school, Maggie had decided she was the champion of quiet. The champion of quiet sat on the gym floor, sandwiched between the champion of daydreaming and the champion of goofy jokes. Maggie felt blue. She knew what was coming. She considered changing her title to champion of last pick. Mr. Murphy, the gym teacher, asked for volunteers to pick the basketball teams. The usual hands shot into the air. Maggie sighed and glanced to her right. She caught the eye of Jasmine, champion of cursive J's. Maggie thought she might like to be Jasmine's friend, but never felt brave enough to talk to her. Looking at Jasmine, Maggie realized that Jasmine seemed a little blue too. Maggie thought, I'm not the only one picked last. Sometimes Jasmine is picked last too. With that, the champion of quiet had an idea. Mr. Murphy asked, "Anyone else want to volunteer today?" Maggie felt her hand slowly rise. She looked again at Jasmine and took a big breath. Maybe it was time for the champion of quiet to use her voice. "Maggie," Mr. Murphy smiled, "you want a turn?" "Do I?" Maggie wondered. "Yes," she said. The class murmured. "Maggie leading a team?" "Yes," she answered again, louder this time. Her voice shook just a little. "What's stopping you then?" Mr. Murphy waved Maggie to the front of the gym, where the other 3 captains, champion of jumping rope on one foot, champion of never misses a shot, and champion of doesn't know how to lose, stood ready to choose their teams. "Maggie, you get first pick," said Mr. Murphy. "Jasmine," announced the champion of quiet. The class snickered. Was this a joke? More than once, Jasmine had tried to score on the wrong basket. Maggie smiled and repeated, "Jasmine." Eyes wide, Jasmine took her place beside Maggie. The other 3 captains called out familiar names, the best players on the basketball court. It was Maggie's turn again. "I choose Jamie." Jamie, champion of the untied shoelace. Jamie could not dribble, throw, or catch. He knew what it felt like to be the last pick. But not today. Jamie jogged to stand next to Jasmine. He tripped only once. The class sat in shock. So it went. The names flowed from Maggie's mouth, sounding sure and strong. The stronger she sounded, the stronger she felt. 3 very talented teams took shape, and then there was Maggie's team. Maggie looked at her teammates. There stood Jasmine and Jamie, plus Jillian, champion of hugs, and George, champion of very big musical instrument. They were grinning at Maggie. Maggie grinned back. I have chosen the worst team in the history of the world, she thought. The champion of quiet walked onto the court with her team close behind, ready to face players who were bigger and better. Game on. The basketball slipped through Jamie's fingers, skated around Jasmine, dribbled itself away from George and Jillian, and bounced off Maggie's head. Twice. Their laughter echoed throughout the gym. Clutching the ball and out of breath from running and giggling, Maggie heard Jasmine call out, "Mags, pass the ball to me." I have a nickname, Maggie thought happily. She threw the ball to Jasmine. Of course, Jasmine missed. They were indeed the worst team in the history of the world. And they did what any worst team would do. They lost. They lost big. But losing a basketball game doesn't make you a loser. Maggie knew that much. Maggie grinned at her team. We are officially the champions of no score, she thought. Awesome. The champion of quiet walked off the court with her new friends. And as the group made plans to sit together at lunch, Maggie was no longer surprised to hear her own voice joining the noisy chorus. All right, so let's again go back and one more time look at our definition of theme, which is the message or the lesson that the author wants you to take away from the story. So let's think about this story, The Champion of Quiet, and our main character, Maggie. The theme of this story is bravery. Maggie is the new girl. She hasn't made a lot of friends. She's very quiet. When she goes to gym class, she's very timid because she knows that she is one of the last students picked to be on teams. But in this instance, Maggie is very brave. She steps outside of her comfort zone and she decides to be a team captain. So the moral or the lesson that we learn is taking a chance and being brave can lead to making new friends and new experiences. Again, the moral or lesson that we learn from this story, The Champion of Quiet, is taking a chance and being brave can lead to new friendships and new experiences. Maggie stood up. She stepped out of her comfort zone. She called on students who were not as popular in the gym class to be on her team. And they had a great time, even though they didn't win the game and they weren't the best team on the basketball court. They formed a bond with each other and many new friendships were started. And once these friendships were started, they can now have some really great experiences with each other. I want to thank you for joining in for our lesson for today on theme. I'll be back with you tomorrow to read another riveting story and talk a little bit more about theme. I hope you have a great day and I'll see you tomorrow.